The sun had gone down hours ago, leaving the prairie wrapped in a blanket of silence broken only by the whisper of the wind. Stars pricked the black sky in their countless millions, steady and sharp, but there was no comfort in them for Caleb Morrow. He had been riding fence all day, chasing down strays from his ragged herd, and the exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. Dust clung to his clothes, sweat dried stiff on his collar, and every jolt of his weary horse rattled his spine like loose nails in a bucket. He was thinking of nothing but getting home, warming beans over the fire, and stretching out under the rafters of his broken-down ranch house when his horse suddenly balked. The gelding's ears went flat, and he tossed his head, blowing through his nostrils as though the very ground carried a warning. Caleb reined him in, patting his neck, eyes scanning the moonlit creek bed up ahead. The cottonwoods stood in a tight knot, their silver leaves shifting in the night breeze, but nothing moved. At first. Then he saw her, a figure slumped against the base of the largest tree, half hidden in shadow. Caleb felt his gut twist before his brain could catch up. He swung down from the saddle, boots sinking into the cool earth, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip out of instinct. The closer he came, the clearer she grew in the pale light. A young woman, maybe no more than 20, her dress torn and dirty, hair in a wild tangle that fell over her shoulders. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath dragging like it cost her more than she could afford to pay. "Ma'am," Caleb called, his voice low but carrying across the stillness. Her head lifted slightly. Even in the dim light he could see her eyes, large, wide, shining with something that wasn't just pain but fear, sharp as a blade's edge. He dropped to one knee, heart hammering harder now. "You hurt." That was when he saw it. An arrow jutted from her side, snapped off at the shaft, the jagged end glistening with blood that had soaked deep into the torn fabric of her dress. It wasn't a clean wound, no neat shot from a hunter. The broken shaft told a story. Someone had fired it, she had run, it had snapped off against a tree or a rock, and now it sat lodged deep in her flesh, its barbed head hidden inside her body. Caleb swore softly under his breath, staring at the wound, at the dark stain spreading slow but steady. He knew enough about ranch injuries, men gored by bulls, hands impaled on fence wire, horses kicked half dead, that pulling out something buried too deep could spill more life than it saved. Before he could say a word, her hand shot out and clamped onto his wrist. Her grip was astonishing, fierce despite how pale and weak she looked. "Please," she rasped, voice dry as sand. Her lips trembled as though forming the words cost her everything. "Please, don't pull it." Caleb froze. Her eyes, black pools full of desperation, locked onto his, and in them he read something that shook him deeper than any wound ever could. This wasn't just a plea of pain. It was a warning. His throat went dry. He swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "You'll die if it stays in there. Infection will set in. Poison. I can't leave it." Her fingers dug into his skin harder, her breath coming ragged. "Don't," she begged again, the word breaking apart in her throat. "Don't pull it." The wind stirred the cottonwood branches, making them whisper above him like ghostly voices. Caleb looked around the creek bed, the shadows deepening at the edge of the firelight moon, half expecting someone to step out. Who had shot her? Where had she come from? And what had she done to be left for dead here? He glanced back at the wound. Blood seeped around the arrow's shaft in slow pulses, and every drop made his jaw tighten. He couldn't just sit here and let her fade away. But her words kept echoing, hard as hammer strikes in his skull. "Don't pull it." He thought of the stories the old hands used to tell around campfires, the ones he laughed at when whiskey loosened tongues, the talk of cursed arrows, of spirits bound into weapons, of wounds that carried more than flesh-tearing barbs. He had never believed any of it. He was a practical man. A rancher. He dealt in cows, land, and the hard work of daylight, not in superstitions. But looking at her, seeing the terror burning brighter in her eyes than the pain, he wondered. Her grip loosened suddenly, her strength fading. Her head rolled to the side, her lips parting in a faint moan. Caleb pressed a hand against her side, feeling the sticky warmth of her blood, and swore again. He couldn't just stand here watching her die. He spoke to her, though her eyes fluttered half shut. "I can't let you go this way, ma'am. Not out here, not alone." He shifted, bracing one hand against her waist to steady her. His other hand closed around the arrow shaft. He could feel the rough wood, splintered and sticky, biting into his palm. Her eyes snapped open then, clear and wide, as though some final spark of strength had lit inside her. Her voice cracked, louder than before, trembling with a fear that cut him to the bone. "Don't. Pull it. Caleb's breath stuck in his chest. His blood ran cold at the sound of her plea, but his hand tightened anyway. He had seen men live when metal or wood was yanked free quick enough. He had seen men die too, but doing nothing had always been the greater sin. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking against the night. "I can't just leave you." The world seemed to still, the creek quiet, the wind pausing in its sighs. Caleb closed his eyes, muttered a prayer to a god he wasn't sure listened anymore, and with one swift pull, he wrenched the arrow free. Her scream tore through the night, raw and jagged, not just pain but something else, something deeper that rattled the marrow of his bones. Caleb fell back, the bloody shaft in his hand, the woman collapsing forward into the dirt. And in that instant, as the fire of her cry echoed through the cottonwoods, Caleb felt it, a shift in the air, a chill that seeped into his skin. His blood ran cold as he realized with a terrible certainty, whatever had been inside her had not wanted to be freed. The night deepened, and the cabin was steeped in silence except for the faint crackle of the fire and the low groan of the wind outside. Every so often, the old shutters rattled, a reminder that the rancher's home, built with his own tired hands, was a fragile fortress against the vast and merciless land. He sat rigidly in his chair, the torn scrap of cloth that had once covered the girl's shoulder now darkened with her blood. His heart was still hammering from the moment he'd pulled the knife free, the echo of her plea, "Don't pull it," burning in his mind like a brand. She lay on his bed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, her face pale under the soft lamplight. The knife wound wasn't as deep as it could have been, but the fact it was poison made his stomach twist in dread. A rattler's venom he knew how to treat, a scorpion's sting he could handle. But this was different. The Apache used poisons brewed from desert plants, meant not just to kill but to send a victim's mind into fever and delirium. He'd heard stories whispered by traders in town, about warriors who died screaming from just a nick. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. He dipped a rag into the pot of boiling water he'd set on the stove and pressed it gently to the wound. She winced, her lips parting, and for a brief moment her eyes fluttered open. "You should have let me die out there," she whispered. Her voice was strained, but beneath it, there was a strange strength, as though she was half accusing, half testing him. "Not my way," the rancher replied simply, wringing out the cloth and setting it aside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into her fevered eyes. "You were bound and left to die. I don't leave folk to the coyotes. Not even if you're Apache." Her lips trembled at that, and then she fell silent again, her head rolling weakly against the pillow. He reached for his old leather satchel, pulling out a tin of herbs he used for cattle injuries, then hesitated. These were good for drawing out infection, but poison. He knew it was like patching a flood with a single board. The hours stretched. He stoked the fire higher, the heat pressing against his skin as sweat beaded along his brow. Outside, an owl called mournfully, and the coyotes sang their midnight chorus across the desert flats. But inside, it was just him and her, the sound of her uneven breathing tying him to the moment. Every time her chest rose and fell, he found himself breathing in rhythm with her, as if afraid that if he let his mind wander, she would slip away. Then came the fever. It crept in slowly, like the desert heat at midday, and soon her skin was burning under his touch. She tossed her head on the pillow, whispering words in her native tongue, fragments of prayer or memory. He caught only pieces. "Mountain, sister, river, home." "Easy now," he said, laying a damp cloth against her forehead. His voice softened, the way he spoke to a spooked colt. "You'll be all right, you're safe." But she shook her head fiercely, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with surprising strength. Her nails dug into his skin as her eyes snapped open, wild, fever bright, almost glowing in the lamplight. "No," she gasped, "not safe. They'll come for me, and for you." Her grip tightened before suddenly going slack, her body collapsing back against the bed. The rancher sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing on him like a stone. Who were they? Whoever had tied her out there? Or her own people, who might see his act of mercy as theft, or worse? He rubbed his wrist where her nails had scratched, then sighed heavily, the sound low and tired. He'd lived long enough to know when fate had dragged him into something larger than himself. The night waned toward dawn. Her fever rose and fell in waves, and he stayed at her side, dozing lightly in the chair only to startle awake at the smallest movement. At one point she cried out in her sleep, her hand clutching his as though clinging to a lifeline. He didn't pull away. For all her warning, For all the danger her presence promised, something in him had already decided, he wouldn't abandon her. When the first gray light of morning slipped through the cracks of the shutters, she was still alive. Exhausted, pale, but alive. He stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold dawn air cool his overheated skin. The desert stretched endlessly before him, painted in pinks and golds, but his eyes lingered on the horizon with unease. Somewhere out there, he knew, riders would be coming. Whether they were friends of hers or enemies, he couldn't yet tell. All he knew was that he had taken her fate into his hands the moment he ignored her desperate plea and pulled the knife free. And now, whatever storm followed, he would have to face it. Behind him, he heard her voice, weak, but steady. "You shouldn't have done it, but now, rancher, you can't let me go." He turned slowly, meeting her gaze through the doorway. Her eyes were clearer now, though still rimmed with fever, and in them burned something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, fear, a promise. The rancher felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders heavier than any saddle. His blood had run cold the moment he pulled that blade, but now it felt as though fire had taken its place, burning a path into a future he hadn't asked for, but couldn't walk away from.